My brother called me the family failure. At his own wedding. Interesting thing about humiliation. Sometimes the worst part isn't the insult. It's watching everyone around you accept it like normal conversation. 200 guests. Crystal chandeliers. String quartet playing somewhere behind us. And my brother smiling with one hand wrapped around a champagne glass while introducing me like I was the cautionary tale attached to his success story. This is our family failure. He laughed after saying it. The practiced kind of laugh people use when they need the room to join them. Interesting, honestly. Because cruel people rarely humiliate you alone. They recruit witnesses. A few guests smiled awkwardly. One man chuckled into his drink. My mother leaned forward immediately. Perfect timing. And added her favorite sentence. The sentence she'd spent years polishing into something that sounded charming instead of cruel. We don't brag about her. There it was. The family slogan. Delivered softly enough to sound harmless. Sharp enough to cut anyway. Interesting thing about emotional abuse. The most damaging lines are usually rehearsed enough to sound casual. My father stared at his plate. Silent. Always silent. And standing beside my brother. The billionaire investor he was desperately trying to impress. Went completely still. Not confused. Not amused. Still. The kind of stillness powerful people fall into right before they realize something in the room doesn't add up. Then he looked directly at me. Not my brother. Me. And said 5 words that changed the entire night. So it's you after all. Interesting, honestly. Because sometimes your life changes the second the right person recognizes your name. My name is Meredith Fisher. I'm 33 years old. Senior Systems Architect at High-End Infrastructure. I design transaction systems. Routing engines. Pipeline architecture. The invisible software that keeps money moving quietly through the country every second. Interesting thing about infrastructure people. When we do our jobs correctly, nobody notices we exist. If you bought groceries this morning, used your debit card, scheduled a hospital payment, there's a reasonable chance one of my systems touched that transaction somewhere along the way. 400 million transactions a day. 9 states. 0 public recognition. And honestly, I used to think I was comfortable with that. Interesting thing about invisible daughters. Eventually you stop asking to be seen because disappointment becomes exhausting. My family had one success story. And according to them, it wasn't me. It was Liam. My younger brother. Startup founder. Media interviews. Tech podcasts. Magazine features. The golden child. Interesting, honestly. Because some families don't choose the most competent child. They choose the loudest one. Liam dropped out of business school at 24 and launched Vidya, a revolutionary data infrastructure startup. That's how my mother described it anyway. She repeated the phrase constantly despite having absolutely no idea what the company actually did. Interesting thing about parents obsessed with appearances. They don't need to understand success. They just need something impressive enough to show other people. My mother loved introducing Liam. Our son the founder. Our son the innovator. Our son the visionary. Meanwhile, I became. Meredith works with computers. Interesting, honestly. Because people minimize what they don't understand? Especially when understanding it would force them to rethink who deserves admiration. The wedding invitation arrived 6 weeks earlier. Cream-colored envelope. Expensive paper. My name written in my mother's careful handwriting across the front like we were the kind of family who still mailed affection formally. Inside. One sentence was underlined in blue ink. Please come for the family. Family. Interesting thing about manipulative families. They usually rediscover emotional language right before they need cooperation. I almost declined. Honestly. I should have. But 3 days earlier, my father texted me for the first time in nearly 2 years. It would mean a lot. 6 words. That was the most emotionally direct statement Roger Fisher had made to me since my college graduation. Interesting, honestly. Because emotionally absent fathers often communicate affection like they're filing tax paperwork. So I said yes. Not because I believed the wedding would magically heal anything, but because some small pathetic part of me still wanted to believe maybe. Eventually, family could become real if you stayed patient long enough. Interesting thing about neglected daughters. We remain hopeful years after logic tells us to stop. The Fisher family group chat reappeared 2 days later. I'd been removed from it months earlier. No explanation. No argument. One day the messages simply disappeared. Interesting, honestly. Because dysfunctional families weaponize exclusion quietly. Liam added me back personally. His message read, "Are you coming or not? Don't make it weird." That was my brother. Even invitations arrived sounding like accusations. I stared at the screen for almost a minute before responding. Not because I didn't know what to say. Because suddenly, I remembered exactly how exhausting my family was. Interesting thing about toxic dynamics. Your body recognizes emotional danger before your mind catches up. My mother followed Liam's message immediately. Please confirm soon. Sienna's family is very particular about head counts. Not. We'd love to see you. Not. It'll mean so much having you there. Head counts. Logistics. Image management. Interesting, honestly. Because some families care more about appearances than relationships. Sienna Calloway, Liam's fiancée, came from old money. Real money. Estate money. Investment fund money. Her father, Gerald Calloway, owned one of the most influential venture firms in the Southeast. And here's the part nobody in my family understood. Gerald's firm already licensed infrastructure built on systems I designed at Hyen. Interesting thing about expertise. The people closest to you are often the least capable of recognizing it. But I didn't think much about that connection initially. At least not consciously. At the time, I was too distracted remembering January dinner at my parents' house. The last family gathering before the wedding invitation. Mrs. Patterson from next door asked me what I did for work. Before I could answer, my mother waved her hand dismissively and said, "Oh, Meredith does database things or something." Database things. Interesting, honestly. Because reducing someone's life work into vague nonsense is a very specific form of disrespect. Then she smiled at Mrs. Patterson and delivered the line she loved most. "We don't brag about her." Mrs. Patterson looked uncomfortable. My father looked at his pot roast. And Liam grinned like someone watching his favorite sitcom rerun. The rest of dinner became another Liam presentation. Funding rounds. Office expansion. Investor meetings. Magazine articles. My mother narrated his life like a museum tour guide desperate to justify ticket prices. Interesting thing about golden children. Their accomplishments become family property. Meanwhile, I sat 3 feet away unnoticed despite building systems used by millions of people every day. And honestly, part of me had accepted that role years earlier. The invisible daughter. The useful daughter. The daughter who built things quietly while louder people collected applause. Huge difference. For years before the wedding, Liam called me at 11 o'clock at night. Panicking. He had promised investors a working real-time data engine. What he actually had was a pitch deck and a fake demo built on spreadsheet macros. Interesting, honestly. Because startup culture often rewards confidence long before competence arrives. I just need the core system working for the presentation. His voice sounded desperate. I'll hire a real team after funding closes. Then my mother called. Twice. Liam's under pressure. Family helps family. And my father. Rare moment? Sent me a text. He could use your help, Mayor. So I helped him. 3 weeks. After midnight. Weekends. Building code on my personal laptop while eating cold takeout in my apartment. I designed a functioning routing engine from scratch. Clean architecture. Documented modules. Scalable infrastructure. Real work. Interesting thing about engineers. We leave fingerprints everywhere inside systems we build. Liam promised me $10,000 and co-architect credit. I received $1,500. No credit. And 14 months later, Vidya launched publicly using my architecture almost line for line. Same structures. Same routing logic. Same module behavior. Even the naming conventions matched. Interesting, honestly. Because people stealing technical work rarely understand how recognizable craftsmanship actually is. I said nothing. Not because I didn't know. Because I already understood how the conversation would go. My mother would call me jealous. My father would disappear into silence. And Liam would grin while saying, "Family helps family." So I archived everything instead. Consulting agreement. Commit logs. Architecture specs. Emails. Every version history timestamp neatly stored inside a blue folder in the bottom drawer of my desk. Not for revenge. Not for leverage. Because engineers document their work. Interesting thing about truth. Sometimes it survives simply because one quiet person kept accurate records while everyone else focused on appearances. 3 weeks before the wedding, I received a LinkedIn message from Callaway Ventures. Senior Technical Analyst. Professional tone. Short message. They had identified architectural similarities between Vidya's engine and published infrastructure documentation connected to my work at Hyan. They wanted to discuss authorship. Interesting, honestly. Because the truth usually surfaces through process long before emotion catches up. I stared at the message for a long time. Then opened the blue folder for the first time in over a year. Liam's signature. My commit logs. 47 entries across 21 days. My architecture specs. And one email from my brother sent at 2:13 a.m. Can you just make the demo work? I'll handle the rest. That email was the last honest sentence Liam Fisher ever wrote to me. And sitting there alone in my apartment? Holding years of proof in my hands? I realized something terrifying. The collision had already started. My family just didn't know it yet. The collision had already started. My family just didn't know it yet. Interesting thing about truth. It rarely explodes immediately. Usually, it moves quietly beneath the surface first. Like pressure building inside pipes nobody bothered to inspect properly. The LinkedIn message sat open on my screen while rain pressed softly against my apartment windows. Callaway Ventures. Senior Technical Analyst. Professional wording. Neutral tone. And buried inside that neutrality, a sentence capable of destroying my brother's entire company. We identified architectural similarities connected to your published infrastructure work. Architectural similarities. Interesting, honestly. Because corporate language becomes incredibly polite right before financial disasters. I opened the blue folder slowly. Same folder. Same documents. Same proof I'd been carrying quietly for 4 years. Liam's consulting agreement. My commit logs. The architecture specs. And that final email. Can you just make the demo work? I stared at the sentence for a long time. Interesting thing about betrayal. Sometimes the evidence feels smaller than the damage it caused. I should explain something important. I never kept the folder for revenge. That matters. Because revenge requires obsession. And honestly, I'd spent years trying not to think about Liam at all. Interesting thing about neglected daughters. Eventually survival depends on emotional distance. At Hyen, my work spoke clearly enough without family validation. The cascade infrastructure I designed handled nearly 400 million transactions every day across 9 states. Hospitals, banks, shipping networks, insurance systems. Invisible architecture holding visible industries together. Interesting, honestly. Because the people building civilization rarely look impressive at dinner parties. My coworker Nora used to joke. You're like a ghost holding the internet together. And honestly, she wasn't entirely wrong. I designed systems. Quietly. Reliably. Without needing applause. Huge difference. But sitting there staring at Calloway's message, I realized something uncomfortable. For years, I'd confused silence with maturity. Interesting thing about scapegoat children. We often mistake emotional suppression for wisdom because it kept the peace growing up. I closed the folder. Then opened a blank text editor. 1 sentence. Simple sentence. I will not lie about my own work. That was it. No revenge fantasy. No dramatic plan. No desire to destroy Liam. Just one boundary I should have established years earlier. Interesting, honestly. Because healing sometimes begins with refusing to participate in your own erasure anymore. I replied to the analyst the next morning. Short response. Professional. Available Thursday afternoon. Then I went back to work. Because systems still needed monitoring. Clients still needed uptime. Infrastructure still mattered even while my personal life quietly approached detonation. Interesting thing about competent people. We continue functioning long after emotionally weaker people would collapse. 3 days before the wedding. Liam texted me directly. Private message. No greeting. No warmth. Be there by 4. Pause. Don't overdress. Another pause. And don't talk about Hyen. I actually laughed. Out loud. Alone in my kitchen. Interesting, honestly. Because controlling people become almost funny once you stop fearing them emotionally. Don't talk about Hyen. The company whose infrastructure his investors already licensed. The company connected directly to the architecture inside Vidya. The company where I spent 6 years building real systems while Liam built presentations pretending to understand them. Interesting thing about fragile egos. They treat expertise like competition instead of reality. That same night, my father called. Only the second voluntary phone call in over a year. His voice sounded tired. Older somehow. Your mother and I. Long pause. We've got a lot riding on this. There it was. Not love. Not reconciliation. Financial desperation disguised as family concern. Interesting, honestly. Because emotionally unavailable parents often rediscover vulnerability only after investments become threatened. We put everything in, Mayor. Everything. Meaning the retirement money. $140,000. 30 years of pension contributions and overtime pay poured into Liam's startup. My parents had bet their entire future on my brother. And the terrifying part? They genuinely believed he understood what he built. Interesting thing about narcissistic family systems. The golden child often starts believing the mythology too. I almost warned Dad. Honestly. For one stupid moment. I considered telling him the truth privately before the wedding. About the IP issue. About the authorship review. About the due diligence process already happening behind the scenes. But then I remembered something painful. Nobody had ever protected me from discomfort in that family. Not once. Interesting, honestly. Because scapegoat children are expected to absorb consequences nobody else would tolerate. So I said nothing. Not out of cruelty. Out of exhaustion. Huge difference. The rehearsal dinner took place at a vineyard outside Charlotte. White tablecloths. String lights. Expensive wine pretending to feel casual. My seat assignment waited near the back beside a service doorway and a potted olive tree. Interesting thing about family events. Placement always reveals hierarchy eventually. Liam and Sienna sat at the center table beside Gerald Calloway. My parents sat nearby. Close enough to look important. Far enough away to still feel grateful. And me? Table 9. Beside strangers. Exactly where my brother wanted me. Interesting, honestly. Because controlling people prefer their scapegoats visible? But not central. During introductions, Liam worked the room like a politician. Perfect handshake pressure. Perfect smile. Perfect rehearsed humility. This is my college roommate. This is our lead investor. This is Sienna's uncle from Connecticut. And finally, this is my sister Meredith. Pause. She works with computers. Computers. Interesting thing about minimization. People reduce your expertise to vague language when specifics threaten their superiority. Nobody asked follow-up questions. Nobody except one older man near the end of the table. Gray hair. Wire-rimmed glasses. Quiet posture. He tilted his head slightly after hearing my name. Then asked, Meredith Fisher? I nodded. I think I saw your name attached to the Atlanta Infrastructure Summit. Tiny silence. Liam's smile flickered. Interesting, honestly. Because insecure people panic immediately when someone else recognizes your value publicly. You work in scalable architecture? Yes. The older man smiled slightly. Thought so. Then he walked away. No big scene. No dramatic moment. But Liam watched him leave with tension around his jawline I'd never seen before. Interesting thing about liars. They fear recognition more than accusation. Driving home from the rehearsal dinner, everything finally clicked into place. Not emotionally. Strategically. Huge difference. Interesting, honestly. Because once you stop craving approval, patterns become obvious. Liam didn't invite me because he loved me. My parents didn't suddenly want reconciliation. They needed optics. A complete family. A normal family. A successful founder with supportive relatives smiling politely in the background. And more importantly, they needed me small. Visibly small. Publicly small. Because if Callaway Ventures connected me to Vidia's architecture, Liam needed the room to already believe I was irrelevant. Interesting thing about narrative control. People discredit you socially before truth surfaces professionally. If I looked quiet enough, forgettable enough, emotionally unstable enough, then anything I said later about authorship could be framed as jealousy, bitterness, sibling resentment. The strategy suddenly became horrifyingly clear. And honestly, that realization hurt more than the stolen code. Interesting thing about family betrayal. The emotional manipulation usually cuts deeper than the financial theft. The wedding morning arrived warm and bright. Callaway Estate looked like something pulled from a luxury magazine. Stone mansion. Perfect lawns. Marble reception hall. String quartet near the entrance. Everything designed to communicate old money without needing to announce it loudly. I almost turned around in the parking lot. Not because I was afraid. Because suddenly, I understood exactly what role everyone expected me to play. Interesting, honestly. Because awareness makes humiliation harder to tolerate quietly. But then I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. Navy dress. Simple watch. Steady expression. And for the first time in years, I asked myself a dangerous question. What if I stopped shrinking for people determined to misunderstand me anyway? Interesting thing about healing. Sometimes it begins as anger before becoming self-respect later. Sometimes healing begins as anger before becoming self-respect later. Interesting thing about awakening. The first symptom is usually exhaustion. Exhaustion from shrinking. Exhaustion from apologizing for your own competence. Exhaustion from pretending other people's comfort matters more than your dignity. I sat in my car outside Callaway Estate gripping the steering wheel while guests in designer suits drifted toward the entrance laughing softly beneath strings of white lights. And for the first time in my life, I realized something terrifying. My family had never actually wanted me invisible. They wanted me useful. Huge difference. Interesting, honestly. Because invisible people can still become dangerous once they stop cooperating quietly. The estate looked expensive in the way old money always does. Not flashy. Certain. Stone walls. Perfect landscaping. Valet attendants moving calmly across circular driveways. The kind of wealth that doesn't need to prove itself loudly because everyone already assumes it belongs there. Interesting thing about real power. It rarely raises its voice. Inside. The reception hall glowed gold beneath crystal chandeliers. A string quartet played near the staircase. Champagne floated past on silver trays. Every surface reflected money. And standing in the middle of it all, my brother looked exactly like someone finally living inside the fantasy he'd spent years rehearsing. Interesting, honestly. Because narcissists don't just want success. They want witnesses. Liam spotted me immediately. Smile activating instantly. Not warmth. Performance. There she is. One hand wrapped around a champagne flute. The other grabbing my elbow lightly before I could even answer. Interesting thing about controlling people. Physical steering becomes emotional shorthand eventually. You're table 11. He said it proudly. Like assigning me seating near the service exit somehow counted as generosity. You can see the whole room from there. I glanced toward table 11. Back corner. Beside a decorative fern. Half hidden behind a marble column. Interesting, honestly. Because hierarchy always reveals itself through placement eventually. As Liam guided me through the crowd, the introductions began. Not normal introductions. Managed introductions. Carefully calibrated reductions of my existence. This is my sister Meredith. Pause. She's the quiet one. Another table. Meredith works in tech support or something. Another laugh. Another smile. Another tiny public cut disguised as humor. Interesting thing about humiliation. People tolerate it longer when cruelty arrives smiling. My mother floated nearby correcting details nobody asked about. Oh, she's very introverted. Works with back-end systems. Never leaves her desk. Every sentence designed to make me sound smaller. Safer. Forgettable. Interesting, honestly. Because some parents spend years shrinking one child to preserve another child's mythology. I let it happen for nearly 15 minutes. Not because I was weak. Because honestly, part of me still couldn't believe adults behaved this way publicly. Then Liam leaned close beside the champagne tower. Relax, Mayor. Grin widening. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. Interesting thing about emotionally abusive families. Eventually they stop hiding the contempt because they assume your silence is permanent. Something inside me shifted then. Tiny shift. But permanent. I removed his hand from my arm carefully. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just deliberate. You can introduce me, I said quietly. But you don't get to script me. Liam blinked. Actually blinked. Like the furniture had suddenly started speaking. Interesting honestly. Because dysfunctional systems panic the second assigned roles stop functioning properly. Then the grin returned. Automatic. Protective. It's a party. And he walked away. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel small watching him leave. Huge difference. Interesting thing about confidence. It arrives quietly after enough humiliation finally stops working. I stayed near the bar afterward drinking sparkling water while the reception expanded around me. And slowly, I started noticing things. Real things. Gerald Calloway moving through conversations without wasting words. People subtly adjusting themselves around him. Investors watching him before deciding how loudly to laugh. Interesting thing about powerful people. Rooms organize themselves around them automatically. Gerald didn't behave like Liam. That stood out immediately. No exaggerated stories. No performance charisma. No constant need for validation. He listened more than he spoke. Observed more than he reacted. The exact opposite of my brother. Interesting honestly. Because competence and insecurity create completely different kinds of energy. At 6:30? The room shifted. Not visually. Emotionally. Gerald had officially entered the reception after finishing wedding photographs outside. My mother straightened immediately. My father adjusted his tie. Liam's voice got louder. Interesting thing about social climbers. They become hyper-aware around people holding financial power. I wasn't supposed to be near them. That mattered later. Table 11 sat across the ballroom. But the bar stood directly between my assigned invisibility and Liam's performance circle. And unfortunately for everyone involved, I happened to be standing there when Liam spotted me. His eyes lit up instantly. Not affection. Opportunity. Huge difference. Interesting honestly. Because manipulative people treat relatives like props whenever status enters the room. Dad, come meet my sister. He said it loudly enough to sound spontaneous. Then grabbed my elbow again before I could decline. I remember noticing strange details walking toward that table. Champagne bubbles. String quartet transitioning between songs. My mother smoothing imaginary wrinkles from her jacket. My father staring into his drink already looking nervous. Interesting thing about trauma. Your brain records bizarrely specific details right before life changes permanently. Gerald turned as we approached. Tall. Gray at the temples. Stillness in his posture. The kind of stillness built from decades of making high-stakes decisions without panicking publicly. And standing beside him, Liam delivered the line. Bright smile. Arm around my shoulder. Voice loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. This is our family failure. Laughter. Not huge laughter. Small social laughter. The worst kind honestly. Because weak people laugh automatically once someone else signals permission. Then my mother added her line immediately. Perfect timing. Perfect smile. We don't brag about her. There it was. The role assignment. Publicly confirmed. The invisible daughter. The unimpressive sister. The cautionary tale beside the founder. Interesting thing about lifelong humiliation. Eventually your nervous system expects you to smile through it automatically. But I didn't smile. Didn't laugh. Didn't perform comfort for them anymore. I just stood there quietly. Back straight. Hands relaxed. Looking directly at Gerald Calloway. And that's when everything changed. Interesting, honestly. Because powerful people notice silence differently than weak people do. Gerald didn't laugh. Didn't smile. Didn't rescue the awkwardness socially. He simply looked at me carefully. Long enough for the atmosphere around the table to tighten. Then, his expression shifted. Recognition. Not vague recognition. Specific recognition. Like a missing variable finally snapping into place inside his head. Interesting thing about truth. Sometimes it walks into the room wearing a name tag nobody expected to matter. So it's you after all. 5 words. Quiet words. Devastating words. Liam's grin froze instantly. My mother stopped moving. My father looked up sharply for the first time all evening. Interesting, honestly. Because reality only becomes frightening once someone credible says it aloud. Gerald stepped closer slightly. Meredith Fisher. Not a question. Confirmation. Cascade architecture. I nodded once. Yes. And suddenly, the entire room began rearranging itself emotionally around information my family never thought mattered. Interesting thing about expertise. The wrong people ignore it for years. Until the right person recognizes it in 5 seconds, the wrong people ignore your value for years. Until the right person recognizes it in 5 seconds. Interesting thing about truth. Once someone credible says it out loud, the entire room starts recalculating itself. Gerald Calloway looked directly at me while my brother's hand slowly slipped from